Reagan.
Good morning, I'm Charles Gibson at the summit in Moscow. On day number 3, President and General Secretary Gorbachev took a walk in the square, Red Square, where the president saw the sights and where the two leaders talked of the future, even taking a Russian youngster in their arms as an example. That's what's going on here. Joan?
All right, good morning, Charlie. It looks like another full day there in Moscow. Yesterday, of course, the president met with a group of 49 refuseniks, people who want to leave the Soviet Union. And the man who sat next to Mr. Reagan was an American named Abe Stolar. And we will talk with him in this hour. Charlie?
Joan, President Reagan is about to address a group of students at Moscow State University, and we are going to be carrying that speech live. With me here, Peter Jennings from ABC News, and we will take you through the speech, I guess. It is an interesting speech because it is a speech, sort of a fatherly talk to these students about the advantages of freedom, and it's really sort of a pitch for the American way, which rather interesting speech.
Interesting place to give it. It's the biggest university in the country. It sits up overlooking Moscow, so everybody's adjacent to all of the political goings-on of the capital. 32,000 students come from all over the place. So while it's not quite as active as most American campuses, it's a very symbolic place, I think, to give the speech.
Gigantic campus. It is, I believe, one of the buildings that was built by Stalin in the 30s. Massive thing. Architecture modeled actually after one of the gates that is on the Kremlin
You really
wall.
have to love that kind of architecture to appreciate it.
You've got to love it. Yes, indeed. They're the hall where he's going to be making the address. He's been running a little bit behind schedule, but we understand he was back on as he headed for the speech. He spent some time over lunch with a group of writers and artists in the Soviet Union, and they talked to him at great length.
If there's somebody in the United States who thinks that looks vaguely familiar, probably very few of us, that's when Yuri Gagarin gave his first news conference, when he came back from being the first man in space.
Anyway, the president it was interesting that the talk that he had today with these writers, one of the cinematographers, the head of the Cinematographers Union, I think, today, when he was talking to the president, stood up and started talking to him about astrology. And the president sort of did a little double take when that was going on. But the president had an interesting speech. He said he called for the publication of a number of books, wanted to see Solzhenitsyn published in the United States, or I'm sorry, in the USSR, and wanted to see. I'm sorry.
Solzhenitsyn's something of a bad word around here in many ways. He's not the most favorite of Russian writers.
No, and the president was saying that he ought to be published here. And we're with Marshall Goldman here, professor of economics at Wellesley College, and who was associate director of the Russian Research Center at Harvard. What was the other thing he called for during his...
Well, he actually, at one point, he called for the liberation of films. The Russian filmmaker. It was really a very bold speech on, and then Reagan indeed was encouraging this kind of freedom of thought, creativity, and he explained why he thinks he makes a good president, because actors try to think positively. And
it's very fertile territory, all of this. The intelligentsia in the Soviet Union has benefited more than any other class from glasnost and from perestroika.
Yes.
That sounds like the president might indeed be arriving.
And indeed, I should just say before he begins that the university has actually now seen some demonstrations recently, which is again part of glasnost. So
he's going to be introduced by Anatoly Luganov there, who's the president of Moscow State University.
This university had a very esteemed American visiting professor at one time, didn't it, Marshall?
Well, I wouldn't know how esteemed it was, but I taught there in 1977 on a Fulbright exchange, of course, in American economics. Luganov, by the way, is interesting because he has been made a representative to the party conference, even though the staff wanted somebody else, an economist named Popov, who was put down and removed, and Luganov ends up being the delegate.
In fact, in very good campus fashion, there was a real battle royal on the campus about who would be the party conference. Let's see if we can hear the translation.
I'm ready to welcome you to the first university in Russia. As in the United States, university in our country is a national pride and represents not only a center of learning, a center of culture and humanism.
Once again, those of you at home are going to get a couple of translations. You'll get Stephen Pearl, chief interpreter at the United Nations, who's working with us, and then the audience will get the benefit of another interpreter there.
Centers of culture and humanism.
The founder of Moscow University, Lomonosov, was not only a genius experimenter and scientist, a great philosopher, poet.
The founder of the University of Moscow, Mikhail Lomonosov, was not only a brilliant scientist, but also a great philosopher, poet, and a man of enlightenment.
Many of the things he achieved have been preserved to this day.
Preserved up to now.
Students of the Moscow University, a student, Chekhov, was here at this university. We and Americans are grateful that he taught people in different continents the love of mankind.
Writer Anton Chekhov was also a student of the University of Moscow, and like Americans, we're grateful to him that he has taught people of different continents love for men.
We are proud of the fact that the revolutionary renewal in our country is connected with the name of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, a graduate of this university who, together with you, wrote the historic treaty for the first time eliminating a whole class of nuclear weapons.
That the revolutionary renewal in our country.
Marshal Goldman confirmed for me Mikhail Gorbachev is the first lawyer ever to leave the Soviet Union.
Actually, he's the first university graduate, period, but in addition a lawyer, so that it adds a double impact. And the others were engineers or from special vocational schools, so he brings a very balanced point of view here.
A whole class of nuclear weapons.
There are good traditions of cooperation in our university with many universities in the world, including American universities, serving to broaden knowledge, mutual enrichment of our cultures.
Has a good tradition.
And the other thing, of course, is that he's really speaking to the cream of Soviet students here. You don't get in unless you're privileged, right?
This is the elite. You've got a national competition. It's like the national merit, but even higher. And it's much more difficult. And they bring really the people. My students were from all over the country, and it was remarkable how good they were.
For 15 years now, from year to year, American professors have been lecturing to students of the historical faculty of Moscow State University. We think this is a good example of a free exchange of information for deepening mutual understanding between our peoples.
For 15 years,
Actually, they have now, as part of the regular course in American Studies, a requirement that you must take a course with an American professor of history. And so we send over on the Fulbright exchange one regular faculty member from an American university.
Which means they almost must have English.
They must have, well, in that particular specialty, in that particular major.
Your valuable present, your gift, sir, the document of George Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, which have consolidated this fine tradition.
Mr. President,
I was just going to say, Marshal, when you raised that, whether or not you taught in Russian or in English.
Well, I tried to teach in Russian as much as I could, but they understood my English better than my Russian, unfortunately. And part of the thing was they wanted to learn English, and American slang in particular.
Beautiful tradition.
We all expect that one of the results of the Moscow meeting at the summit will be the further development of humanitarian contacts and broader exchange of students. Let us hope that the youth of our two countries will get to know each other better, because the future belongs to them.
I should point out that we're beginning next year in many American colleges, about 15 of them to be exact, a program of an exchange of undergraduates. In the past, it's always been graduates, except for a program at SUNY. So this, too, is moving forward in an exchange.
For future belongs to them.
Mr. President, in preparing for this meeting, we have tried to take into account the wishes of the American side and the tradition of your public statements.
When preparing this meeting, we try to take
One thing I have learned since I have been here, when there is a brief introduction in a speech, or when there are brief remarks to be made to the president anywhere, their definition of brief.
We give you the floor, Mr. President, and welcome you. In you, the great American people with whom we want to live together in peace, friendship, and cooperation.
Mr. President, we welcome in you.
President Buganov apparently heard you, as he's about to wind up.
Who would like to live in peace,
Don't forget,
friendship,
it's very
and
important for the
cooperation.
Russians. This is as important for them as anything that could possibly be.
I can't imagine that the president's going to have a more appreciative audience in the abstract sense. There's a real hunger in this country among young people to know about America.
And I want to thank all of you very much for a very warm welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here at Moscow State University, and I want to thank you all for turning out. I know you must be very busy this week, studying and taking your final examinations. So let me just say, Желаю вам успеха. Nancy couldn't make it today because she's visiting Leningrad, which she tells me is a very beautiful city. But she too says hello and wishes you all good luck. Let me say it's also a great pleasure to once again have this opportunity to speak directly to the people of the Soviet Union. Before I left Washington, I received many heartfelt letters and telegrams asking me to carry here a simple message. Perhaps, but also one of the most important business of this summit. It is a message of peace and goodwill and hope for a growing friendship and closeness between our two peoples. As you know, I've come to Moscow to meet with one of your most distinguished graduates. In this, our fourth summit, General Secretary Gorbachev and I have spent many hours together, and I feel that we're getting to know each other well. Our discussions, of course, have been focused primarily on many of the important issues of the day, issues I want to touch on with you in a few moments. But first, I want to take a little time to talk to you much as I would to any group of university students in the United States. I want to talk not just of the realities of today, but of the possibilities of tomorrow. Standing here before a mural of your revolution, I want to talk about a very different revolution that is taking place right now, quietly sweeping the globe without bloodshed or conflict. Its effects are peaceful, but they will fundamentally alter our world, shatter old assumptions, and reshape our lives. It's easy to underestimate because it's not accompanied by banners or fanfare. It's been called the technological or information revolution. And as its emblem, one might take the tiny silicon chip, no bigger than a fingerprint. One of these chips has more computing power than a room full of old-style computers. As part of an exchange program, we now have an exhibition touring your country that shows how information technology is transforming our lives, replacing manual labor with robots, forecasting weather for farmers, or mapping the genetic code of DNA for medical researchers. These microcomputers today aid the design of everything from houses to cars to spacecraft. They even design better and faster computers. They can translate English into Russian or enable the blind to read or help Michael Jackson produce on one synthesizer the sounds of a whole orchestra. Linked by a network of satellites and fiber optic cables, one individual with a desktop computer and a telephone commands resources unavailable to the largest governments just a few years ago. Like a chrysalis, we're emerging from the economy of the Industrial Revolution, an economy confined to and limited by the Earth's physical resources, into, as one economist titled his book, The Economy in Mind, in which there are no bounds on human imagination, and the freedom to create is the most precious natural resource. Think of that little computer chip. Its value isn't in the sand from which it is made, but in the microscopic architecture designed into it by ingenious human minds. Or take the example of the satellite relaying this broadcast around the world, which replaces thousands of tons of copper mined from the earth and molded into wire. In the new economy, human invention increasingly makes physical resources obsolete. We're breaking through the material conditions of existence to a world where man creates his own destiny. Even as we explore the most advanced reaches of science, we're returning to the age-old wisdom of our culture, a wisdom contained in the book of the Genesis in the Bible. In the beginning was the Spirit, and it was from this Spirit that the material abundance of creation issued forth. But progress is not foreordained. The key is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of information, freedom of communication. The renowned scientist, scholar, and founding father of this university, Mikhail Lomonosov, knew that. It is common knowledge, he said, that the achievements of science are considerable and rapid, particularly once the yoke of slavery is cast off and replaced by the freedom of philosophy. You know, one of the first contacts between your country and mine took place between Russian and American explorers. The Americans were members of Cook's last voyage on an expedition searching for an Arctic passage. On the island of Unalaska, they came upon the Russians, who took them in, and together with the native inhabitants, held a prayer service on the ice. The explorers of the modern era are the entrepreneurs, men with vision, with the courage to take risks and faith enough to brave the unknown. These entrepreneurs and their small enterprises are responsible for almost all the economic growth in the United States. They are the prime movers of the technological revolution. In fact, one of the largest personal computer firms in the United States was started by two college students, no older than you, in the garage behind their home. Some people, even in my own country, look at the riot of experiment that is the free market and see only waste. What of all the entrepreneurs that fail? Well, many do, particularly the successful ones, often several times. And if you ask them the secret of their success, they'll tell you it's all that they learned in their struggles along the way. Yes, it's what they learned from failing, like an athlete in competition or a scholar in pursuit of the truth. Experience is the greatest teacher. And that's why it's so hard for government planners, no matter how sophisticated, to ever substitute for millions of individuals working night and day to make their dreams come true. The fact is, bureaucracies are a problem around the world. There's an old story about a town, it could be anywhere, with a bureaucrat who was known to be a good-for-nothing, but he somehow had always hung on to power. So one day in a town meeting, an old woman got up and said to him, "There is a folk legend here where I come from, that when a baby is born, an angel comes down from heaven and kisses it on one part of its body. If the angel kisses him on his hand, he becomes a handyman. If he kisses him on his forehead, he becomes bright and clever. And I've been trying to figure out where the angel kissed you so that you should sit there for so long and do nothing." We are seeing the power of economic freedom spreading around the world. Places such as the Republic of Korea, Singapore, Taiwan have vaulted into the technological era, barely pausing in the industrial age along the way. Low-tax agricultural policies in the subcontinent mean that in some years India is now a net exporter of food. Perhaps most exciting are the winds of change that are blowing over the People's Republic of China, where 1/4 of the world's population is now getting its first taste of economic freedom. At the same time, the growth of democracy has become one of the most powerful political movements of our age. In Latin America in the 1970s, only 1/3 of the population lived under democratic government. Today, over 90% does. In the Philippines, in the Republic of Korea, free, contested democratic elections are the order of the day. Throughout the world, free markets are the model for growth. Democracy is the standard by which governments are measured. We Americans make no secret of our belief in freedom. In fact, it's something of a national pastime. Every 4 years, the American people choose a new president, and 1988 is one of those years. At one point, there were 13 major candidates running in the 2 major parties, not to mention all the others, including the socialist and libertarian candidates, all trying to get my job. About 1,000 local television stations, 8,500 radio stations, and 1,700 daily newspapers, each one an independent private enterprise, fiercely independent of the government, report on the candidates, grill them in interviews, and bring them together for debates. In the end, the people vote. They decide who will be the next president. But freedom doesn't begin or end with elections. Go to any American town, to take just an example, and you'll see dozens of churches representing many different beliefs, in many places synagogues and mosques, and you will see families of every conceivable nationality worshiping together. Go into any schoolroom, and there you will see children being taught the Declaration of Independence, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that no government can justly deny. The guarantees in their Constitution for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion go into any courtroom, and there will preside an independent judge, beholden to no government power. There, every defendant has the right to a trial by a jury of his peers, usually 12 men and women, common citizens. They are the ones, the only ones, who weigh the evidence and decide on guilt or innocence. In that court, the accused is innocent until proven guilty, and the word of a policeman or any official has no greater legal standing than the word of the accused. Go to any university campus, and there you'll find an open, sometimes heated discussion of the problems in American society and what can be done to correct them. Turn on the television, and you'll see the legislature conducting the business of government right there before the camera, debating and voting on the legislation that will become the law of the land. March in any demonstration, and there are many of them. The people's right of assembly is guaranteed in the Constitution and protected by the police. Go into any union hall where the members know their right to strike is protected by law. As a matter of fact, one of the many jobs I had before this one was being president of a union, the Screen Actors Guild. I led my union out on strike, and I'm proud to say we won. But freedom is more even than this. Freedom is the right to question and change the established way of doing things. It is the continuing revolution of the marketplace. It is the understanding that allows us to recognize shortcomings and seek solutions. It is the right to put forth an idea scoffed at by the experts and watch it catch fire among the people. It is the right to dream, to follow your dream, or stick to your conscience, even if you're the only one in a sea of doubters. Freedom is the recognition that no single person no single authority or government has a monopoly on the truth, but that every individual life is infinitely precious, that every one of us put on this world has been put there for a reason and has something to offer. America is a nation made up of hundreds of nationalities. Our ties to you are more than ones of good feeling. They're ties of kinship. In America, you'll find Russians, Armenians, Ukrainians, peoples from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. They come from every part of this vast continent, from every continent to live in harmony, seeking a place where each cultural heritage is respected. Each is valued for its diverse strengths and beauties and the richness it brings to our lives. Recently, a few individuals and families have been allowed to visit relatives in the West. We can only hope that it won't be long before all are allowed to do so, and Ukrainian Americans, Baltic Americans, Armenian Americans can freely visit their homelands just as this Irish American visits his. Freedom, it has been said, makes people selfish and materialistic. But Americans are one of the most religious peoples on earth because they know that liberty, just as life itself, is not earned, but a gift from God. They seek to share that gift with the world. Reason and experience, said George Washington in his farewell address, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. And it is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Democracy is less a system of government than it is a system to keep government limited, unintrusive, a system of constraints on power to keep politics and government secondary to the important things in life, the true sources of value found only in family and faith. But I hope you know, I go on about these things not simply to extol the virtues of my own country, but to speak to the true greatness of the heart and soul of your land, who, after all, needs to tell the land of Dostoevsky about the quest for truth, the home of Kandinsky and Scriabin about imagination, the rich and noble culture of the Uzbek man of letters, Alisher Navoye, about beauty and heart. The great culture of your diverse land speaks with a glowing passion to all humanity. Let me cite one of the most eloquent contemporary passages on human freedom. It comes not from the literature of America, but from this country, from one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, Boris Pasternak, in the novel Dr. Zhivago. He writes, "I think that if the beast who sleeps in man could be held down by threats, any kind of threat, whether of jail or of retribution after death, then the highest emblem of humanity would be the lion tamer in the circus with his whip, not the prophet who sacrificed himself. But this is just the point. What has for centuries raised man above the beast is not the cudgel, but an inward music, the irresistible power of unarmed truth." The irresistible power of unarmed truth. Today, the world looks expectantly to signs of change, steps toward greater freedom in the Soviet Union. We watch and we hope as we see positive changes taking place. There are some I know in your society who fear that change will bring only disruption and discontinuity, who fear to embrace the hope of the future. Sometimes it takes faith. It's like that scene in the cowboy movie, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which some here in Moscow recently had a chance to see. The posse is closing in on the two outlaws, Butch and Sundance, who find themselves trapped on the edge of a cliff with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet to the raging rapids below. Butch turns to Sundance, and says their only hope is to jump into the river below. But Sundance refuses. He says he'd rather fight it out with the posse, even though they're hopelessly outnumbered. Butch says that's suicide and urges him to jump. But Sundance still refuses and finally admits, I can't swim. Butch breaks up laughing and says, you crazy fool, the fall will probably kill you. And by the way, both Butch and Sundance made it, in case you didn't see the movie. I think what I've just been talking about is perestroika and what its goals are. But change would not mean rejection of the past. Like a tree growing strong through the seasons, rooted in the earth and drawing life from the sun, so too positive change must be rooted in traditional values, in the land, in culture, in family, in community. And it must take its life from the eternal things, from the source of all life, which is faith. Such change will lead to new understandings, new opportunities, to a broader future in which the tradition is not supplanted, but finds its full flowering. That is the future beckoning to your generation. At the same time, we should remember that reform that is not institutionalized will always be insecure. Such freedom will always be looking over its shoulder, a bird on a tether. No matter how long the rope can always be pulled back. And that is why in my conversation with General Secretary Gorbachev, I have spoken of how important it is to institutionalize change, to put guarantees on reform. And we've been talking together about one sad reminder of a divided world, the Berlin Wall. It's time to remove the barriers that keep people apart. I'm proposing an increased exchange program of high school students between our countries. General Secretary Gorbachev mentioned on Sunday a wonderful phrase you have in Russian for this: better to see something once than to hear about it 100 times. Mr. Gorbachev and I first began working on this in 1985. In our discussion today, we agreed on working up to several thousand exchanges a year from each country in the near future. But not everyone can travel across the continents and oceans. Words travel lighter, and that's why we'd like to make available to this country more of our 11,000 magazines and periodicals, and our television and radio shows that can be beamed off a satellite in seconds. Nothing would please us more than for the Soviet people to get to know us better and to understand our way of life. Just a few years ago, few would have imagined the progress our two nations have made together. The INF Treaty, which General Secretary Gorbachev and I signed last December in Washington, and whose instruments of ratification we will exchange tomorrow. The first true nuclear arms reduction treaty in history, calling for the elimination of an entire class of US and Soviet nuclear missiles. And just 16 days ago, we saw the beginning of your withdrawal from Afghanistan, which gives us hope that soon the fighting may end and the healing may begin, and that suffering country may find self-determination, unity, and peace at long last. It's my fervent hope that our constructive cooperation on these issues will be carried on to address the continuing destruction of conflicts in many regions of the globe, and that the serious discussions that led to the Geneva Accords on Afghanistan will help lead to solutions in Southern Africa, Ethiopia, Cambodia, the Persian Gulf, and Central America. I have often said, nations do not distrust each other because they are armed. They are armed because they distrust each other. If this globe is to live in peace and prosper, if it is to embrace all the possibilities of the technological revolution, then nations must renounce once and for all the right to an expansionist foreign policy. Peace between nations must be an enduring goal, not a tactical stage in a continuing conflict. I've been told that there's a popular song in your country, perhaps you know it, whose evocative refrain asks the question, do the Russians want a war? In answer it says, go ask that silence lingering in the air above the birch and poplar there. Beneath those trees the soldiers lie. Go ask my mother, ask my wife. Then you will have to ask no more, do the Russians want a war? But what of your one-time allies? What of those who embraced you on the Elbe? What if we to ask the watery graves of the Pacific or the European battlefields where America's fallen were buried far from home? What if we were to ask their mothers, sisters, and sons, do Americans want war? Ask us too, and you'll find the same answer, the same longing in every heart. People do not make wars, governments do. And no mother would ever willingly sacrifice her sons for territorial gain, for economic advantage, for ideology. A people free to choose will always choose peace. Americans seek always to make friends of old antagonists. After a colonial revolution with Britain, we have cemented for all ages the ties of kinship between our nations. After a terrible civil war between North and South, we healed our wounds and found true unity as a nation. We fought 2 world wars in my lifetime, against Germany and one with Japan. But now the Federal Republic of Germany and Japan are 2 of our closest allies and friends. Some people point to the trade disputes between us as a sign of strain. But they're the frictions of all families, and the family of free nations is a big and vital and sometimes boisterous one. I can tell you that nothing would please my heart more than in my lifetime to see American and Soviet diplomats grappling with the problem of trade disputes between America and a growing, exuberant, exporting Soviet Union that had opened up to economic freedom and growth. And as important as these official people-to-people exchanges are, nothing would please me more than for them to become unnecessary, to see travel between East and West become so routine that university students in the Soviet Union could take a month off in the summer and, just like students in the West do now, put packs on their backs and travel from country to country in Europe, and with barely a passport check in between. Nothing would please me more than to see the day that a concert promoter in, say, England could call up a Soviet rock group without going through any government agency and have them playing in Liverpool the next night. Is this just a dream? Perhaps, but it is a dream that is our responsibility to have come true. Your generation is living in one of the most exciting, hopeful times in Soviet history. It is a time when the first breath of freedom stirs the air and the heart beats to the accelerated rhythm of hope, when the accumulated spiritual energies of a long silence yearn to break free. I am reminded of the famous passage near the end of Gogol's Dead Souls. Comparing his nation to a speeding troika, Gogol asks, what will be its destination? But he writes, there was no answer save the bell pouring forth marvelous sound. We do not know what the conclusion of this will be, of this journey, but we're hopeful that the promise of reform will be fulfilled. In this Moscow spring, this May 1988, we may be allowed that hope, that freedom, like the fresh green sapling planted over Tolstoy's grave, will blossom forth at last in the rich, fertile soil of your people and culture. We may be allowed to hope that the marvelous sound of a new openness will keep rising through, ringing through, leading to a new world of reconciliation, friendship, and peace. Thank you all very much, and da blagoslavit va Gospod. God bless you.
President Reagan, half an hour he's spoken to these students and faculty and perhaps some others at Moscow State University. A speech to make any American proud, and a speech which, if it gets wide circulation in the Soviet Union, may well have some serious, profound effect. With me, Marshall Goldman, Charlie Gibson, or wherewith Charlie Gibson. Haven't figured this out yet, Charlie. What's your impression?
Whether I'm here with you. Right. It's classic Ronald Reagan. It was Ronald Reagan preaching. And it's an extraordinary speech, I think, Marshall, in that he is really laying out the kinds of freedoms he wants to see in this country and trying to convert this country.
I think it was in a sense taking the momentum.
The President has kindly agreed to answer your questions.
The President's going to have a question and answer session with the students here.
He doesn't have all that much time.
We are going to remain here for the moment with this.
Therefore, if anyone has a question, please come to the microphone and ask the question.
Mr. President has kindly agreed to answer your questions, but since he doesn't have too much time, only 15 minutes, so those who have questions, please ask them.
This is a reaffirmation of what you said, Marshall. There are some English-speaking students there. Others were able to hear this on these, as you might have seen at home, on these translations.
History faculty.
Господин президент,
Mr.
я
President,
рад приветствовать
I
вас
am
в
happy to
нашем
welcome you
университете.
to our university.
Позвольте задать вам такой
I'd like
вопрос.
to ask you this question.
Я думаю, я выражу общее
I
мнение
think I'm
своих
expressing the general view of my
товарищей
comrades, my
студентов,
students, if I say
прорыв в улучшении
that the breakthrough to the better in relations between our two countries will be a consummation of your presidency. What do you think about that? As a president, as a member of the Republican Party, as a human being, how would you feel about achieving a new concrete agreement with our General Secretary by the end of the year?
This is a student from the history faculty, and he...
Well, I think what's interesting about this is that Reagan was playing his own theme, but at the same time playing some themes of the General Secretary. It's an attempt, you said during the talk, it was like taking perestroika and building on it, but there were always a few sharp digs there that were going a little bit beyond where Gorbachev himself would like to go.
The President had his first question from one of the students here as to how he feels about an agreement. He may be referring to an arms control agreement, which is very much on the Soviet mind, more so than any other subject to the summit.
For you and the General Secretary to get a treaty on the limitation of strategic arms during the time that you are still president.
Well, the arms treaty that is being negotiated now is the so-called START treaty, and it is based on taking the intercontinental ballistic missiles and reducing them by half, down to parity between our two countries. Now, this is a much more complicated treaty than the INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Treaty, which we have signed and which our two governments have ratified and is now in effect. So there are many things still to be settled. You and we have had negotiators in Geneva for months working on various points of this treaty. Once we had hoped that maybe, like the INF treaty, we would have been able to sign it here at this summit meeting. It is not completed. There are still some points that are being debated. We are both hopeful that it can be finished before I leave office, which is in the coming January. But I assure you that if it isn't, I assure you that I will have impressed on my successor that we must carry on until it is signed. My dream has always been that once we've started down this road, we can look forward to a day, you can look forward to a day when there will be no more nuclear weapons in the world at all.
You see it on the streets here.
Any other questions?
And that is the genuine feeling that almost everybody you run into has about peace and arms control.
Psychology faculty. Mr. President, in your speech you said that university discussions should have an influence on public opinion, on policy. I'd like to ask you, in your view, how have student and youth problems changed since you were a young person until today? Student and youth problems in the United States, how have they changed since the president was a young man compared with today?
Just ask Mr. Reagan to go back about 60 years.
It's unfortunately not a very hard question. I should say that usually the Soviets handle these things in a very structured way. These are not just spontaneous, even though she was not reading from a question. It's not just who gets in line first. They usually are.
I'm not sure that's the case anymore, Marshall. Really?
In my experience, I think in my experience, this is still something that's very important to them. And in other meetings, you're right. But I think in something like this, this has been the thing that I've seen. In their own meetings.
At your time, they were one type, now they have changed.
Well, I know there was a period in our country when there was a very great change for the worst. When I was governor of California, I could start a riot just by going to a campus. But that has all changed. And I could be looking out at an American student body as well as I'm looking out here and would not be able to tell the difference between you. I think that back in our day, I did happen to go to school and get my college education in a unique time. It was the time of the Great Depression, when in a country like our own there was 25% unemployment. And the bottom seemed to have fallen out of everything. But we had, I think, what maybe I should be telling you from my point here, because I graduated in 1932, that I should tell you that when you get to be my age, you're going to be surprised how much you recall the feelings you had in these days here, and that how easy it is to understand the young people because of your own having been young once. You know an awful lot more about being young than you do about being old. And I think there is a seriousness, I think there's a sense of responsibility that young people have, and I think that there's an awareness on the part of most of you about what you want your adulthood to be and what the country you live in, you want it to be. And I have a great deal of faith. I said the other day to 76 students, they were half American and half Russian. They had held a conference here and in Finland and then in the United States. And I faced them just the other day, and I had to say I couldn't tell the difference looking at them, which were which. But I said one line to them. I said, I believe that if all the young people of the world today could get to know each other, there would never be another war. And I think that of you, I think that of the other students that I've addressed in other places. And of course, I know also that you're young, and therefore there are certain things that at times take precedence. I'll illustrate one myself. 25 years after I graduated, my alma mater brought me back to the school and gave me an honorary degree. And I had to tell them, they compounded a sense of guilt I had nursed for 25 years, because I always thought the first degree they gave me was honorary. You're great, carry on.
Not altogether sure that that will translate, Marshal Goldman, into...
Except that they're applauding, you see. Прошу, пожалуйста, еще вопросы?
Any further questions?
Сказали, что совместные советско-американские усилия
efforts to bring about the settlement of regional conflicts will continue. In which regions of the world do you think efforts to eliminate tension should be directed? Central America, Southeast Asia, South Africa? I'd be grateful for an answer.
Well, now this is probably the first hard question about substance, and it'll be interesting to see if he refers to Nicaragua or to Angola.
At the settlement of the Afghanistan question, and it might involve the settlement of other regional...
The President and the General Secretary have not yet got on to regional issues in a big way here, but there is a talk in the wind about a settlement about Cuban troops in Angola in Southeast Africa, which have been in some cases acting as surrogates for the Marxist government there.
South Africa, where Namibia has been promised its independence as a nation, another new African nation. But it is impossible because of a civil war going on in another country there, and that civil war is being fought on one side by some 30 to 40,000 Cuban troops who have gone from the Americas over there and are fighting on one side with one kind of authoritative government. When that country was freed from being a colony and given its independence, one faction seized power and made itself the government of that nation. And leaders of another seemingly majority of the people had wanted simply the people to have the right to choose the government that they wanted. And that is the civil war that is going on. But what we believe is that those foreign soldiers should get out and let them settle it. Let them, the citizens of that nation, settle their problems. And the same is true in Nicaragua. Nicaragua made a promise. They had a dictator. There was a revolution. There was an organization and it was aided by others in the revolution. And they appealed to the Organization of American States for help in getting the dictator to step down, stop the killing. And he did. But the Organization of American States had asked, what are the goals of the revolution? And they were given in writing. And they were the goals of a pluralistic society, of the right of unions and freedom of speech and press and so forth, and free elections, a pluralistic society. And then the one group that was the best organized among the revolutionaries seized power, exiled many of the other leaders, and has its own government which violated every one of the promises that had been made. And here again, we're trying to encourage the giving back those, or the making those promises come true and letting the people of that particular country decide their fate.
He did in the speech. He did in the speech, after all, give the Soviets a compliment. He mentioned the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and he did talk about some other things. So this gives him a chance to explain his feelings about Nicaragua.
Меня очень беспокоит судьба 310 советских солдат, которые пропали без вести в Афганистане.
There are some Russian soldiers, Soviet soldiers missing in action in Afghanistan.